No one in Boston's elite social circles could understand why Victoria Hayes smiled when she was told she was about to lose everything. For 22 years, she had stood faithfully beside her husband, William Sterling, helping him build one of the most respected logistics empires in the country. She had attended every charity gala, hosted every corporate fundraiser, and remained at his side through every triumph and setback. Yet only 48 hours after William's funeral, the same people who once praised her loyalty were whispering that she had finally been exposed for what they believed she had always been, a gold digger who had lost her golden ticket. The rumors spread faster than grief itself. William had died unexpectedly from a silent heart attack, leaving behind a devastated widow and two adult children from his first marriage, who had never accepted Victoria as part of their family. Nathan Sterling and his younger sister Caroline had spent years masking their resentment behind polite smiles and obligatory holiday visits. Now, with their father gone, they no longer had any reason to hide their true feelings. The morning after the funeral, Victoria sat alone in the enormous family library when the lawsuit arrived. She read every page carefully. Nathan and Caroline were demanding complete ownership of the Sterling estate, Sterling Global Logistics, every investment account, every property, and every remaining asset associated with William's legacy. It wasn't simply a challenge to the will, it was a declaration of war. When Daniel Brooks, her longtime attorney and closest confidant, arrived at the mansion later that afternoon, he found Victoria sitting quietly beside the fireplace, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "They've lost their minds," Daniel said, tossing the legal documents onto the coffee table. "This case won't survive 6 months in court." Victoria looked up calmly. "How certain are you?" Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "Certain? Victoria, we have evidence, witnesses, financial records. William protected you extensively. They don't have a chance." For several moments, she remained silent. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows of the estate William had loved so deeply. Then she asked a question Daniel never expected. "What happens if I give them everything?" The attorney actually laughed. "That's not funny. I'm not joking." The color drained from Daniel's face. "Victoria, if you sign everything over, you'll walk away with nothing. No estate, no company, no protection." She stood slowly and walked toward the massive windows overlooking the property. The gardens William had designed stretched into the distance, beautiful despite the storm gathering overhead. "Perhaps," she said quietly. Daniel approached her cautiously. "What aren't you telling me?" For the first time since William's death, Victoria smiled. It wasn't a smile of grief. It wasn't even a smile of acceptance. It was the smile of someone who had already seen the ending of a story no one else understood. "Daniel," she said softly, "have you ever noticed that people become blind when they're staring at something they desperately want?" He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Because suddenly, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt afraid. "Victoria, I want you to prepare the documents." "No, I do. You don't understand what you're asking." She turned to face him fully. "No," she replied. "I understand exactly what I'm asking." Over the next week, the news spread through Boston's wealthiest neighborhoods like wildfire. William Sterling's widow had surrendered. No negotiations, no legal battle, no resistance. At exclusive country clubs and private charity events, people shook their heads in disbelief. Some called Victoria weak. Others called her broken. Nathan and Caroline called it justice. They celebrated their victory in the penthouse suite of the Sterling Tower Hotel, drinking imported champagne while laughing about how easily their stepmother had surrendered. 22 years, Nathan said, raising his glass. "And she folds in less than a week." Caroline laughed. "I almost expected her to put up a fight." Neither of them noticed the expression on Edward Whitmore's face. Their attorney wasn't celebrating. He had reviewed the final transfer documents 3 separate times and still couldn't explain why Victoria Hayes had signed them so willingly. And for the first time in his distinguished legal career, Edward found himself hoping that he had overlooked nothing. Because the final hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. And deep inside, he had begun to fear that Victoria Hayes wasn't surrendering at all. She was waiting. Tuesday morning arrived beneath a curtain of cold rain. The courthouse in downtown Boston had witnessed countless inheritance battles over the years, but few had attracted the attention that surrounded the Sterling case. News vans lined the streets. Reporters crowded the entrance. Members of Boston's business elite filled the hallways, eager to witness what everyone believed would be the final humiliation of William Sterling's widow. By 9 o'clock, every seat in the courtroom had been occupied. Nathan Sterling entered first. He wore a charcoal suit worth more than most people earned in a month, and the confident smile on his face suggested that the outcome had already been decided. Caroline followed beside him in a cream-colored designer dress, greeting familiar faces with the relaxed confidence of someone preparing to inherit a fortune rather than participate in a legal proceeding. "We should celebrate tonight," she whispered. Nathan smirked. "I already made reservations." Across the courtroom, attorney Edward Whitmore organized his files with unusual care. He had barely slept the night before. Something about Victoria's behavior continued to bother him. Wealthy people rarely surrendered without demanding concessions. Intelligent people never surrendered without a reason. And Victoria Hayes was unquestionably intelligent. At precisely 9:23, the courtroom doors opened. The room fell silent. Victoria entered alone. She wore a crimson silk blouse beneath a tailored black jacket. Her dark hair was elegantly arranged, and her expression carried none of the grief or fear that everyone had expected. Instead, she appeared calm, peaceful, beautiful even. For a brief moment, Nathan felt a strange sensation settle into the pit of his stomach. Then he reminded himself that within an hour, everything she possessed would belong to him. Victoria took her seat beside Daniel Brooks. The attorney leaned toward her. "We can still stop this." She smiled softly. "No, Daniel, this doesn't have to happen." "Yes," she replied quietly. "It does." The judge entered moments later, and the courtroom rose. After the procedural formalities concluded, Edward Whitmore stood confidently. "Your Honor," he began, "all parties have reached a voluntary agreement regarding the transfer of assets and ownership interests associated with the Sterling estate and Sterling Global Logistics." The judge adjusted his glasses. "And Mrs. Hayes fully understands the consequences of this agreement?" Edward nodded. "She does." The judge looked directly at Victoria. "Mrs. Hayes, do you understand that by signing these documents, you permanently surrender all claims to the Sterling estate, including substantial financial assets and corporate interests?" Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Victoria rose gracefully. "I understand completely, Your Honor." "And you do so voluntarily?" "Yes." No hesitation. No emotion, no regret. A murmur spread through the spectators. Nathan leaned back in his chair, unable to hide his satisfaction. After years of resentment, years of believing that his stepmother had manipulated his father, victory had finally arrived. Everything William built would return to his rightful family. At least, that's what he believed. Victoria walked toward the signing table. Her heels echoed softly through the silent courtroom. Daniel watched helplessly. Edward watched nervously. Nathan and Caroline watched triumphantly. The court clerk handed Victoria the documents. She glanced at them only briefly. Then, with a steady hand and an almost serene expression, she signed every page. Just like that, it was over. Nathan couldn't stop himself from smiling. Caroline squeezed his arm. "We did it," she whispered. Camera flashes erupted throughout the courtroom. The judge prepared to finalize the transfer. Edward stepped forward one final time to review the executed documents before they were officially entered into the record. It was a routine procedure, one he had performed hundreds of times before. He flipped through the pages. Then, he stopped. A strange expression crossed his face. He turned back a page. Then another. His smile disappeared. The color drained slowly from his face. "No," he whispered. His hands began to shake. The courtroom fell silent once again. Nathan frowned. "Edward?" The attorney didn't answer. He continued reading, again and again, as if he desperately hoped the words in front of him would somehow change. "Edward," Caroline said, standing now. "What's wrong?" The attorney looked up. For the first time since entering the courtroom, genuine fear was visible in his eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. "My God!" The silence inside the courtroom became unbearable. For several seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Nathan Sterling stared at Edward Whitmore as if waiting for the attorney to laugh and explain that this was some bizarre misunderstanding. But Edward wasn't laughing. The veteran lawyer who had spent 3 decades negotiating billion-dollar mergers looked as though he had just witnessed a fatal accident. "Edward," Nathan repeated, his voice harder this time. "What is wrong?" Edward slowly lowered the documents. His hands were trembling. "We can't finalize this transfer." The statement exploded through the courtroom like a gunshot. A wave of whispers spread among the reporters and spectators. The judge frowned and leaned forward. "Mr. Whitmore," he said firmly, "explain yourself." Edward swallowed. "There appears to be an addendum." Daniel Brooks closed his eyes. Not because he was surprised. Because he had been waiting for this exact moment. Nathan stepped toward the attorney and snatched the papers from his hand. "What addendum?" He flipped through the pages impatiently. Then, he found it. 3 pages. Buried deep within the transfer agreement. Pages he had never bothered to read carefully because he had been too focused on claiming his victory. Caroline moved beside him. "What does it say?" Nathan read the first paragraph. At first, he didn't understand. Then he read it again. And the blood drained from his face. The courtroom watched in silence as his confident expression transformed into something else entirely. Fear. Pure, unmistakable fear. "No," he whispered. Caroline grabbed the document from his hands. Her eyes raced across the page. "The acquiring parties agree to assume all existing, pending, undisclosed, historical, present, and future liabilities associated with Sterling Global Logistics." She stopped breathing. "No," her voice cracked. No. Edward removed his glasses and rubbed his face. "The liability transfer clause is legally binding." Nathan looked up. "That's impossible." "It isn't. You would have seen this." Edward's expression darkened. It was disclosed. The words landed like a hammer. Disclosed, not hidden. Not forged. Not illegal. Simply ignored. Nathan turned toward Victoria. She remained standing exactly where she had been moments earlier, her hands folded calmly before her, her expression unchanged. For the first time since his father's death, Nathan felt genuine terror. "What have you done?" he asked. Victoria studied him quietly. Then she answered, "Exactly what you asked me to do." The courtroom remained frozen. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes. Nathan shook his head violently. No, this is about debt. We can handle debt." Daniel Brooks finally stood. His voice was calm. "You haven't read the final page." Nathan stared at him. "What final page?" Daniel looked at Victoria. She nodded once. "The federal audit provision." The words hit Edward Whitmore before they hit anyone else. His face turned white. Oh God, Caroline looked between them. What federal audit? Daniel removed a copy of the agreement from his briefcase. Clause 17. Upon transfer of ownership, an immediate independent federal review of all financial records, transactions, tax filings, corporate expenditures, and executive authorizations conducted during the previous 10 years shall automatically commence. Nathan's knees nearly gave way. No, the room began spinning around him. No, 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 because there was one thing no one else in that courtroom knew. Except Victoria. 3 weeks before William Sterling's death, she had discovered financial records hidden inside William's private office. Records that revealed millions of dollars had disappeared from Sterling Global Logistics over several years. Money redirected through shell companies, fake invoices, offshore accounts, a sophisticated embezzlement operation. Nathan's operation. William had discovered the theft shortly before his death. He had planned to confront his son. He never got the chance. But Victoria had. And instead of exposing Nathan immediately, she had waited, patiently, quietly, until Nathan's greed made him demand ownership of everything, including the evidence. Nathan stumbled backward. You knew, he whispered. Victoria's expression softened. I did. You planned this. Yes, Caroline began crying. You destroyed us. For the first time all morning, Victoria's composure shifted, not into anger, not into triumph, but into sadness. No, she said quietly. You destroyed yourselves. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. 3 men in dark suits entered, and the badge hanging from the first man's jacket instantly drained the last remaining color from Nathan Sterling's face. FBI. The moment the 3 federal agents entered the courtroom, the atmosphere changed completely. Just seconds earlier, the room had been filled with whispers, curiosity, and disbelief. Now, an almost suffocating silence settled over everyone present. Even the reporters, who had spent the morning fighting for the best photographs and sound bites, stood frozen. Nathan Sterling couldn't move. He stared at the badges clipped to the agents' jackets as though they belonged to figures from a nightmare he had desperately hoped would never become real. The lead agent approached the bench calmly. Your Honor, he said, presenting his credentials, we have received authorization to secure evidence related to an ongoing federal investigation involving Sterling Global Logistics. The judge removed his glasses slowly. I see. Nathan suddenly found his voice. This is absurd. He shouted. There has to be some mistake. No one responded. Because everyone in the courtroom had already begun to understand what had happened. Caroline grabbed Edward Whitmore's arm. Do something, she whispered frantically. The attorney looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Helplessness. There is nothing I can do. The words shattered whatever hope she had left. Nathan turned toward Victoria. She remained exactly where she had been standing moments earlier. Calm, composed, untouched by the chaos unfolding around her. You set me up, he said through clenched teeth. Victoria met his gaze. No, Nathan, her voice was gentle. I gave you exactly what you demanded. The distinction was devastating. Because deep down, Nathan knew she was right. No one had forced him to file the lawsuit. No one had forced him to demand every asset. And no one had forced him to sign documents he had never bothered to read. His greed had done that. The federal agents requested immediate access to the company's financial records and executive communications. Reporters erupted into action, shouting questions and racing toward the courthouse exits to break the story first. Mrs. Sterling, did you commit corporate fraud? Miss Sterling, were you aware of the financial misconduct? Mrs. Hayes, did you orchestrate this investigation? Camera flashes exploded throughout the room. Caroline broke down completely. "This can't be happening," she sobbed. But it was. Within hours, news networks across the country were broadcasting the collapse of Sterling Global Logistics. Financial analysts discussed allegations of corporate embezzlement. Former employees came forward with stories of suspicious transactions and hidden accounts, and for the first time in years, people stopped talking about William Sterling's wealth. Instead, they talked about his betrayal. 2 days later, federal agents arrived at the corporate headquarters. Employees watched from the sidewalks as investigators carried boxes of documents, hard drives, and financial records out of the building. Television helicopters circled overhead. By sunset, Nathan Sterling had been formally arrested on multiple federal charges, including corporate fraud, grand larceny, tax evasion, and financial conspiracy. The image of him being escorted into a government vehicle became the most shared photograph in the country that week. Caroline's downfall came more slowly. Unlike her brother, she hadn't orchestrated the crimes. But by accepting ownership of the company and its liabilities, she had inherited its crushing debts as well. Creditors descended immediately. Properties were seized. Accounts were frozen. Luxury cars disappeared. Within weeks, nearly everything she had spent her adult life collecting was gone. Meanwhile, Victoria returned to the Sterling estate one final time. The mansion felt strangely peaceful. The silence no longer carried grief. It carried closure. She walked through each room slowly, remembering the life she and William had built together, their first Christmas in the house. Summer evenings spent on the terrace, the dreams they had shared before greed had poisoned everything. In William's private study, she paused. A framed photograph sat on the desk. William was smiling. She picked up the picture gently. "I kept my promise," she whispered. There were tears in her eyes. Not tears of victory, tears of farewell. As she left the study, Daniel Brooks was waiting in the hallway. He shook his head and laughed softly. "I spent 30 years practicing law," he said, "and I've never witnessed anything like what you did." Victoria smiled. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." Daniel stared at her. "You destroyed an empire." She looked back toward William's office one final time. "No." Her voice was quiet. "I simply allowed the truth to survive." But neither of them noticed the envelope sitting on the passenger seat of Victoria's car. An envelope that William had prepared before his death. And inside it was one final secret. The envelope remained unopened for nearly 3 days. Victoria discovered it only after leaving the Sterling estate for the last time. Exhausted by the emotional weight of the past several weeks, she had driven to a small hotel outside Boston before beginning the journey toward her new life on Cape Cod. It wasn't until she reached into the back seat to retrieve her overnight bag that she noticed it. A cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. Williams. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. That was impossible. William had been gone for nearly a month. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter, along with several legal documents and a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. She sat in silence before unfolding the letter. "My dearest Victoria," it began. The sound of his voice filled her mind immediately. "If you are reading this, then I failed to do what I should have done while I was still alive. I failed to protect you from the consequences of my own mistakes." Tears formed instantly. William continued. "I spent years pretending I didn't see what Nathan was becoming. I convinced myself that time, responsibility, and love would eventually change him. I was wrong." Victoria closed her eyes. She remembered the sleepless nights during William's final months, the private conversations that stopped whenever she entered the room. The sadness he carried behind his smiles. He had known. Perhaps not everything, but enough. Several weeks ago, the letter continued. I discovered evidence of financial crimes within the company. Before I could confront Nathan, I prepared a contingency plan. Daniel knows some of it, but the final decision was always yours. She looked toward the brass key. The key opens a private safety deposit box. Inside, you'll find everything I wanted you to have, not because you earned it through loyalty, but because you gave me 22 years of genuine love when I least deserved it. By the time she finished reading, tears were flowing freely. Not because of the money, not because of the secrets, but because, even in death, William had tried to protect her. The next morning, accompanied by Daniel Brooks, Victoria visited the private bank listed in William's letter. The safety deposit box was small, almost disappointingly so. Inside were several family photographs, handwritten letters, a collection of heirloom jewelry that had belonged to William's mother, and documents establishing a private offshore trust fund created years earlier. Daniel stared at the figures. William left you enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Victoria smiled through her tears. He knew me well enough to know that wasn't what mattered. There was one final item inside the box. A photograph. William sat beside Victoria on a beach in Cape Cod. They were laughing. Young, happy, free, on the back, William had written 6 words. Thank you for choosing me. 3 months later, Victoria moved permanently into a sunlit cottage overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The house was modest, beautiful, peaceful. For the first time in decades, she no longer attended corporate dinners or charity galas. Instead, she spent her mornings walking along the shoreline and her afternoons volunteering at the local library. Using part of William's trust, she established a scholarship fund for children from struggling families. The local community embraced her immediately, not because she had once been wealthy, but because she was kind. Meanwhile, Nathan Sterling eventually accepted a plea agreement and received a 15-year federal prison sentence. Caroline found employment at a small accounting office while spending years repaying the judgments and debts she had inherited. The Sterling empire disappeared. Its buildings were sold. Its name faded. Its legacy became a cautionary tale taught in business schools and whispered about in elite social circles. But Victoria never spoke publicly about what happened. She didn't need to. On quiet evenings, she would sit beside her fireplace, holding William's photograph and watching the ocean beyond her window. She had never wanted revenge. She had wanted justice. And in the end, justice had cost her everything she thought she valued only to give her everything she truly needed. Perhaps that was William's final gift after all. If Victoria's journey of wisdom, resilience, and poetic justice moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments. Was Victoria's decision an act of revenge, justice, or both? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable stories of family, betrayal, and extraordinary human strength.